Hi, this is Dr. Josh Helman, and I just interviewed Alex Howard. What an amazing interview. You're not going to want to miss this one. He shared with me some unique viewpoints on how trauma can contribute to chronic conditions like Alzheimer's and caregivers for conditions like Alzheimer's. So stay tuned, and peace and plants. Alex Howard is founder and chairman of the Optimum Health Clinic, one of the world's leading integrative medicine clinics, with a team of 25 full-time practitioners supporting thousands of patients in 50-plus countries. The OHC team integrates a therapeutic coaching approach with functional nutrition. Alex is creator of the therapeutic coaching methodology, and since March of 2020, has been documenting his therapeutic work with real-life patients via his Therapy with Alex Howard YouTube series. In the last few years, Alex has created some of the largest online conferences in the health and mind-body markets, including the world-leading Trauma Super Conference. Alex's online conferences have been attended by over 1 million people. Alex has published academic research in publications such as the British Medical Journal, Open, and Psychology and Health, and is the author of the books Why Me and Decode Your Fatigue. Alex's latest book, It's Not Your Fault, Why Childhood Trauma Shapes You and How to Break Free, is out now. Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Josh with Alzheimer's Breakthrough, and my next guest here, Alex Howard, is amazing. Most people think Alzheimer's is about just age and genetics, but Alex Howard says the real root cause might be emotional overload and other things too. And without further ado, Alex, thank you so much for joining the podcast here.
Hey, Josh, good to be here. Thank you for having me. Excited to get into this conversation.
Awesome. And so many places to start, but let's start with you personally. I read that as a younger person, you actually went through 7 years of chronic fatigue syndrome and somehow figured out a way out of that. Is that true?
I like to think I'm still young, Josh, but when I was a much younger man, I suffered from ME, otherwise known as chronic fatigue syndrome, for 7 years in my teenage years. And, you know, at the time it was devastating. You know, I had complete, obviously debilitating fatigue, but also muscle pains, dizziness, headaches. And for the first couple of years, was just getting more and more sick and was going around seeing various doctors and therapists and nutritionists and naturopaths. And I had a grandmother who was very ahead of her time and had a real passion for all of natural healthcare and so on. But after a couple of years, reached a point where I was still getting worse, not better. And it wasn't that I wasn't practically planning how I was going to end my life, but I certainly reached a very deep place of desperation. And you know, I wasn't fatigued because I was depressed and anxious, but because I was so fatigued, of course, there was a sense of pointlessness and hopelessness to my life and a sense of deep anxiety about what's wrong, why is it wrong, will I ever get better, like why do I have all these symptoms? And I think, you know, anyone, I'm sure there'll be many people listening to this conversation who have or are suffering with a medically unexplained illness. And when you don't have that medical clarity, that creates a whole other level of sort of distress that goes alongside. And so about that point, a couple of years in, I had a conversation with my uncle, basically helped me realize that if I wanted the circumstances of my life to change, then I was waiting for someone else to change them. I could be waiting for the rest of my life. And so he helped me realize that I could become what I would now call the captain of the ship of my own healing journey. And I spent the next 5 years fairly obsessively on a healing journey and read many hundreds of books and saw many practitioners. At one point, I think I was taking over 70 supplements a day, which is not something I think you or I would recommend to anyone. But you know, just trying to figure out how to get back from this state of deep fatigue into a state of health. And well, what I say these days is, I was trying to find the answer, and I failed to find the answer because there isn't one answer. What I found was there was many answers, and there's lots of different pieces to the jigsaw of whether that health journey is a chronic health journey, whether it's a chronic fatigue journey, whether it's a sort of brain health journey, whether it's someone that's noticing cognitive decline, whatever the journey is that someone's on, there's really one thing. There's typically many things. The piece that over the last 20-something years has become my specialist focus has been looking at the impact of childhood trauma on the nervous system and how the nervous system impacts so many things in our lives. But in the clinic that I run, the Optimum Health Clinic, our team of psychology practitioners work alongside a team of functionally medicine trained nutritional therapists. So I very much see that health journey as needing to be integrative, like bringing together these different pieces. It needs to, of course, be evidence-based, but it's also personalized. And that journey, people often say, how does you get well? To which I respond by saying, what you're really asking is how you're going to get well, and it may be a different journey.
100%. But what I'm hearing from you, though, the very first step was actually taking ownership for yourself. And was that one moment, or how you were talking to your uncle? How did you make that decision to be the captain of the ship?
Yeah, well, he asked me an interesting series of questions. He started off by asking me, well, on a scale of 0 to 10, how badly do you want to be well? And I was like, well, that's a bit of a dumb question. I want to be well more than anything. I was like, well, there are things I wouldn't do. Like I wouldn't murder. I don't know why, but what I came up with is I wouldn't murder someone, and I wouldn't chop my own arm off. Maybe I'd have chopped a leg off. That wasn't on the list, but I wouldn't chop an arm off. So I was like, I'm 9.5 out of 10. He's like, okay, great. He's like, okay, make a list of all the things that you yourself believe that you could do to change the situation. And on that list, I had, at this point, I at least knew that there was benefit to things like meditation and yoga. I was realizing that what I ate had some impact. I was realizing that the role of psychology, although I didn't like the fact that my mind might be impacting, that was a role. So I had some things that I thought I could do. He said, okay, so how many hours a day do you spend doing the things that, like, you yourself have said could make a difference? And I was like, well, none. He's like, okay. He's like, well, how many hours a day do you spend watching television? Now, this was 1998. So we are talking before the dawn of good television. We're not talking about the kind of amazing world of sort of Netflix and Amazon and, all these Hulu, all these amazing kind of like, we're talking about really bad, like British and Australian soap operas.
Right.
But the answer was like about 7 hours a day.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And, and like for people listening to or watching this conversation, maybe they're not watching TV, maybe they're scrolling social media. Like there's, maybe they're gaming, like whatever it may be. But it was like, okay, so help me reconcile. You're 9.5 out of 10. You've got a list of things. You're not doing them, but you're watching 7 hours of television a day. And it was like this kind of moment of epiphany where I was like, holy cow, like I want this to change. There are things I could be doing that I'm not doing. And I have all this time. And okay, I'm chronically ill. I feel horrendous, all these symptoms all of the time. But I could be doing more than I'm doing. And so that was the turning point, but it wasn't like a kind of Hollywood movie where it all was better the next day. It was then 5 years of kind of misery, basically, a kind of grueling healing journey. But the difference was fundamental, because the difference was, as you pointed out, this recognition that taking responsibility. And, from that point forwards, I had a fundamentally different relationship to my body, to my habits, to my behaviors. And there were many challenges after that. But I was no longer the victim of the circumstance. I was proactively working to change the circumstance.
And during those 5 years or longer, it was grueling. But let me ask you this. Were there even glimmers of hope during the awful period? Or was it 100% just awful?
No, there were definitely. It wasn't 5 years of total hell, and then it suddenly got better at the end. It was a gradual pathway of recovery along that, and each breakthrough along the way was very meaningful and meant a lot at the time. I remember, the first year of that, I had quite a complex and toxic family situation. I was stuck at home, and then I recovered enough within a year that I could go and live at university, and I still had to go to bed every afternoon for hours, and I still couldn't go out and socialize and do, but at least I was out of that situation, and that was a huge step forwards, and then I remember being able to, a bit further down the path from there, get up in the morning and go for a 30-minute walk. And I was at university near the beach. I'd be able to go and walk on the beach for half an hour every morning. And that was a huge, I had to go back to bed for hours afterwards. But there were those moments of coming back into the world. I think for anyone who's sort of severely debilitated, sort of physically or cognitively in any kind of way, we often have this, well, if I could do that, then I'd really know that this had changed. And for me, that was to be able to properly exercise, like to be able to run and not just be able to exercise, but to be able to exercise and not have what often happens with fatigue conditions is a delayed fatigue response, where you do something and maybe you're okay doing it, and then a couple of days later, the whole system crashes. So, I remember the first time going for a run and then not crashing after. So there were many kind of amazing experiences along the way. And, having worked over the last 20-something years now with well over 10,000 people through the clinic with sort of complex fatigue-related conditions, it very commonly, when one has been ill for many years and they get well again, people will use words like, I feel like I've been reborn, or, I feel like I've died and gone to heaven. It's like, because the most basic things, when you can't do them, or when you do them with a lot of suffering for many years, it's the most extraordinary thing. And, and on the other side, that one of the reasons why I was so determined and so sort of passionate in that early chapter of my career, and still am these days in so many ways, was I need to spread this message. I need people to know that one doesn't have to suffer for their whole life.
That's beautiful. And for the audience here, which is mainly people with Alzheimer's and caregivers and other neurologic disorders, one question that comes to mind is, are some of these cases of brain fog or just not thinking clearly related to the previous traumas? And the next step is, if you fix or deal with those traumas, does sometimes the brain fog or other things go away?
So the answer is yes, that absolutely is possible. I think let's bring a slightly different lens to this, which is that in my work with fatigue-related conditions, so the book, I've written various books. The book I wrote 4 years ago now on fatigue was called Decode Your Fatigue, because to be able to effectively map a pathway to healing, you first have to decode what's going on. And going back to what we were saying a bit earlier, what may be going on for one person could be different for another person. And so, cognitive decline or brain degeneration, these are all labels. Brain fog particularly is a label for a symptom that doesn't tell us why we have that symptom. So I think before we have conversation about what we're going to do to potentially address that, we first need to decode what's causing it. And in the fatigue population that's been a big part of my work, brain fog is a very common symptom. And, brain fog can have many causes. Actually a very common cause of brain fog is gut dysbiosis. That could be small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That could be parasites. That could be, a whole bunch of things that could be going on. But when you've got undigested food particles that are getting through the gut line and getting into the bloodstream, the immune system's reacting to them, brain fog is a very common response to that. And so it isn't necessarily the case that when someone has cognitive symptoms, that is a straight line of losing of capacity. Sometimes it's a symptom of something else that, when it's effectively addressed, allows that capacity to start to come back. But then to answer kind of more directly your question, what's that relationship between trauma and the nervous system and what's happening psycho-emotionally and how that's impacting upon the brain? So to unpack a couple of bits, firstly, I think we have to define what we mean when we're talking about trauma.
Sure.
Because I think often people think about trauma as being these big dramatic events, like what we might call post-traumatic stress disorder. Like you've been physically abused, sexually abused, you've been in a war zone, you've been in a car crash, you've witnessed something incredibly shocking. And of course, that kind of trauma exists. But that's what I would call overt traumas, like things that are clearly defined as being traumatic. And there's a whole body of research looking at those kinds of traumas in childhood, what we'd call adverse childhood experiences, and the direct relationship between those traumas and impacts through life. But often the things that shape us the most are not necessarily those big dramatic events that happen. They're what I would call covert traumas, like more subtle things. That another way of talking about this is maybe we could say trauma's the things that happen to us, but childhood emotional neglect is the things that didn't happen to us that needed to happen for us, or didn't happen for us, needed to happen for us, right? An example of that might be we had parents that loved us, but they were incredibly busy working hard to provide the life they wanted to provide for us because they loved us. That meant we didn't get the quality time and connection and contact with our caregivers. That meant that we didn't feel safe in our body and safe in our nervous system in childhood. The way we responded to that was our nervous system sped up. And so we always perhaps had a little bit of a sense of being on edge. Maybe we noticed we had anxiety. Maybe as a kid, we spoke too quickly. We ate too quick. Like we just kind of had this agitated state. And what we've learned to do in our life is we're constantly trying to think our way to a feeling of safety. So there's a deficiency of that felt sense of safety. So we're constantly trying to get there in our mind. What that means is our brain is always working harder than it needs to. It means that our nervous system is always dysregulated. In fact, just to speak to the nervous system briefly, think about it, there's two different types of stress. There's acute stress. You and I are walking down the street in London. We don't see the big red London bus coming towards us. Suddenly we see it. We leap out the way. We get a hit of adrenaline, cortisol. We need those stress hormones to fight. Probably not going to fight the bus, but maybe with a saber-toothed tiger, maybe we fight. To flight, to get away from the threat, or to freeze and to hope the threat's going to pass us without hitting us. We need stress hormones to help us respond immediately to that threat and to that danger. Chronic stress is where the source of the and in that acute stress, sorry, just to finish that point, the threat comes and then it leaves. We know the threat has left, and then our nervous system returns to a state of balance. In chronic stress, the threat doesn't leave. So our nervous system stays in that constant state of dysregulation. So then tracking this back to childhood, there could be those overt traumas, those things, physical abuse, sexual abuse, growing up in a family where there's drug use, parent is incarcerated, the sort of classic kind of things. There could be these more subtle things. We didn't get emotionally validated the way that we need. We didn't get a sense of co-regulation that taught our nervous system that we were safe. We learned that love was tied to what we did and what we achieved, not for who we were as we were. So those things happened. One of the ways we responded to that was our nervous system sped up because the world was a threat. The world was not a safe place to be. We get normalized to living in that state. It's what I call a maladaptive stress response, a healthy response to stress that's now become maladaptive. The challenge is we normalize. So we don't necessarily recognize we're in this maladaptive state because we've got so used to it, we don't see the wood for the trees, like it is just the way that it is. But that is having enormous impacts on our physical functioning, our emotional functioning, our mental functioning. We can unpack that a bit more if helpful in a minute. The other thing I would just say around sort of trauma and neglect, which I think is also important, is it's not typically the things that happened or the things that didn't happen. It's the adaptive responses that we developed to survive the things that happened or the things that didn't happen. Adaptive responses could be our system speeds up and we spend our life in a state of anxiety. Could be our system shuts down and we spend a lot of time feeling depressed because there's a numbing and a shutdown. It could be that we attempt to self-medicate that feeling of unsafety through drugs, alcohol, food, or whatever it may be. It could be that we look to the other in relationship to try to provide what's missing. And when we look to someone else provide what's missing and we don't develop it in ourselves, we end up often in toxic relationship dynamics. So many of the things that we struggle with in our lives, it's not what happened or what didn't happen, it's what we learned to do to respond to that then perpetuates the cycle of suffering. And then all of these things are impacting upon our functioning through our life, which of course then, it's not just impacting our physical body, it's impacting the functioning of our brain as well.
That makes perfect sense. So a lot of right brain type things. How in your center or your programs, how do you address those issues?
I think the first thing is we've got to recognize what's happening, right? It's like we've got to, one of my sort of big things at the moment in my sort of work is, be it in my work working therapeutically, but also in my sort of kind of business life is, let's just make sure we're solving the right problem. Like so often someone's going in well-intentioned and they're putting a lot of effort and energy to try to fix the wrong thing, right? And so therapeutically what that often looks like is someone goes and sees a clinician because they have anxiety and the intervention is let's try and fix the anxiety. But it's probably the wrong problem. The problem is what's going on in the first place of which anxiety is a symptom. Same thing with a medical doctor working with the physical body. Someone goes in with headaches and it's like, okay, well, let's give you a treatment for the headaches, as opposed to asking what's going on, which is out of balance, of which headaches are the symptom. Right.
Like what's causing the inflammation in your brain that you're feeling as a headache. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the inflammation may be a sort of intelligent response, which is making things worse, not better. Right. Often inflammation is the immune system responding to things that it sees as threats that are actually not threats, which by the way, I think is an interesting bridge, just briefly. I haven't answered your question yet. I will come back to your question, but interesting bridge, which is that when the nervous system is dysregulated, we will mentally and emotionally typically respond to things as threats that are not actually threats. So interesting research, if you show people photos of facial expressions when they're in a state of nervous system dysregulation, they will read neutral faces as being a threat because their system is a confirmation bias, like we're looking for threat and we see it. But the same thing happens with the immune system. So when our nervous system is dysregulated, often the immune system becomes hypersensitive. So what you then find is you get this patient group where they have lots of food intolerances, they have multiple chemical sensitivities, but they never get the cold or the flu. And what's happening is the system is overreacting, like it's seeing everything as a threat, so it has all these sensitivities. But it's one of the things I think people often miss is that it takes a great deal of our daily units of energy to run the immune system, right? So let's imagine like we've got 100 units of energy a day to run our mind, our emotional body, and our physical body. Let's say sort of baseline, it's taking 15 of those units to run our immune system, and just to keep it kind of ticking over and running sort of in its healthy functioning. If we are constantly reacting to threats in the environment, which of course one of the symptoms would be inflammation, and headaches could be an example of those symptoms, we're now going from maybe 15 units to 60 units of energy, which means we have less for everything else, which means we feel tired. And we can see this. If someone gets the cold or gets the flu, you can have relatively minor, a bit of a sneeze and, and a bit of a sort of, sore throat, whatever. But why do we feel so tired? We feel tired because the more units of energy are now being required to run the immune system to fight the threat, to return us back to sort of normal function.
Right, exactly right. The body's saying, hold off a second. I need to focus on the immune system, not on the other things you want to do right now.
Right, exactly. And so to go back to your question though, around how do we work with this? So first we need to define the problem, make sure we're addressing the right problem. if we recognize we're in a state of maladaptive stress response, often what I have with people, I'll sit down with someone one-on-one, particularly back in the day when I used to do a lot of kind of clinical work, and I explain this, and people will go, it just makes so much sense, but it's not true for me because I'm not in a dysregulated state. And yet they're so dysregulated that me as an empathetic person's like feeling anxious in the presence of this person because they're so wired in their system. So the first thing is we need to recognize what's actually happening, to identify, okay, it may be, and by the way, it may be the system's really activated and we identify that state of sort of, excess of kind of cortisol, adrenaline, and so on. But other times the system is so activated it's going into shutdown. So actually the signs are more a sense of numbness, a sense of shutdown, a sense of not really feeling very much at all. And we've gone from fight and flight into freeze. Like the system's got so activated, it's now protecting itself and it's now shutting itself down. So we need to recognize what's happening. The second step is we need to start examining, well, how and why is this happening? Like I have a sort of phrase in my work that if you can see it, you don't have to be it. So the more awareness we have of, okay, I can see actually that these things have happened historically. We unpack that and make sense of that. I can see my nervous system became overactivated. I see I got normalized to that. And I can see the sort of the thoughts, the patterns, the beliefs, the habits that are perpetuating, that are sustaining that state of dysregulation. The third step, so in fact, these sort of steps spell out an acronym. So the first one is to recognize, that's R. The second step is E, which is to examine. The third is we need to stop those habits and patterns. We need to retrain. We need to rewire what's happening in our thoughts, our habits, our behaviors. It's like we've got so used to, for example, let's say we've got a people-pleasing or a helper or a sort of kind of fawning pattern where we constantly make everyone else's needs more important than our own. Someone asks us for something, our physical body or our emotional body says, no, I don't have the resource. We ignore that to make the other person's need more important. We've got to catch those behaviors and stop those behaviors. And we've got to do that enough times that we're retraining our brain and we're retraining our nervous system to change those habits of behavior. We also need to teach, to learn how to self-regulate our nervous system. And just to track this back a little bit as well to childhood, the ideal scenario is we get the physical and emotional holding from our caregivers, typically, mum and dad, which allows our nervous system to co-regulate with their nervous system, which teaches us that we're safe and it builds that sort of foundation side of us. If we didn't get good co-regulation, we didn't likely learn self-regulation. So part of this third step of resetting the nervous system is we need to learn how to self-regulate our system. And there's many different ways we can do that. There's breath work, there's meditation practice, there's kind of moving practices like yoga, tai chi, qigong. But we need to learn how to self-regulate our nervous system. At this point, we've come quite a long way. We've got the awareness, we recognize what's happening, we examined why, we stop the patterns. But typically an interesting thing starts to happen here, which is that our mind starts to run a bit slower. We start to connect a bit more to our physical and emotional body. But then we often start to feel the feelings and the emotions that we have neglected and we have not been feeling historically. It's almost like we're walking around our life with a big black sack of all the stuff that we've not dealt with, all the stuff that's been suppressed, repressed, and sort of shoved away. And as we start to come more into our body, we often start to feel that. So the fourth step of resetting the nervous system is our emotions. So we have to do some emotional healing work. We have to allow ourselves to connect to feel, to process those feelings and those emotions. And then the fifth step is we have to transform our relationship with ourselves. That often means developing more empathy, kindness towards ourselves, but often also to transform our relationships with other people. That means having healthy boundaries, and often that's a piece that's missing. So those 5 steps spell out reset. So it's recognize, examine, it's stop, it's emotions, and then it's transform or transformation. And that each of those steps is important, but also the sequence of those steps is important, because you need to have the awareness to be able to work on the patterns. If you try to do emotional healing work when the system is dysregulated, often it makes things worse, not better. Because if the system is dysregulated and you start going into feeling your feelings and your emotions, it's like having a distressed adult trying to give care to a distressed child. We need to have the regulation in ourselves to be able to hold and to feel those feelings and those emotions.
Wow. And how does that actually happen in practice? Is it the vagus nerve? What systems actually provide that bridge?
I'm a really big fan of, so in terms of biologically, yes, the vagus nerve is that connection between what's happening in the mind and what's happening in the body. The vagus nerve is sort of the long nerve that wanders from the brain right through the system, and it is that connector. In terms of the actual interventions, there are ways of, there are some sort of systems and tools that will do sort of stimulation and do things and they can have their place. But for me, what's much more important is the individual becoming aware of what's happening and learning specific tools and strategies to change what's happening. Because you need to bring with you the conscious mind, like the awareness of what's happening. You need to bring with you the feelings, the emotions, but ultimately, a big part of what this is a reconnecting of the mind and the body. Like it's a kind of, because what typically happens through trauma and what typically happens through when the nervous system becomes dysregulated is there's a disconnect. We sort of go in our mind and we sort of live in this place of disconnection. And at the heart of the healing is a reconnection of the mind and body. And then sort of going back to one of the things that you were sort of touching on earlier as well, for the physical body to heal, we need to be connected to it, but also for the brain to function at its optimum, it needs to be connected to what's happening in the rest of the system. And, the heart, one of the big impacts of trauma, neglect, of nervous system dysregulation is there's a fragmentation of the brain and the mind from what's happening in the rest of the system.
So one question I had for you is, you mentioned at the beginning that you're part of a practice, an integrative practice in London. How did you find integrative medicine? And then my follow-up to that is, how can other people find an integrative functional doctor? Because I was meeting with a patient last week from London, and she said, like, it's really hard to find a good integrative doctor. And I've heard the same thing in the United States, so I don't think it's unique to England. But
yeah, well, firstly, I mean, my journey to integrative medicine was, as we talked about earlier, my own kind of healing journey, and the realization that you've got to work with these kind of multifaceted, complex conditions. You can't just treat one piece of the jigsaw. You've got to be able to see the whole jigsaw to be able to work with that. And so when I started the Optimum Health Clinic over 21 years ago now, I was just super committed to this idea that you've got to have that integrative approach and understanding. In fact, I'm allergic to anyone claiming that one thing is the whole thing. I just think it to me, it just highlights one or two things. It either highlights like total ignorance of the person, or someone that's got a vested financial interest in trying to sell the thing that they're trying to sell, because you just can't do this work long enough and become overly simplistic about these sort of complex things. The Optimum Health Clinic has got patients now in 50 countries around the world. And so, we work very internationally with the people that we work with. There are some elements where someone's going to need a sort of a local practitioner, and that, that definitely has its place. I think part of the challenge as well is that what I notice is functional medicine or integrative medicine is not a sort of uniform one type of practitioner or one kind of specific way of working. Obviously, it's a label for lots of different sort of approaches and so on. And I think for me, there's a really important balance of being innovative, like being sort of bold enough and brave enough to step outside of sort of currently accepted mainstream perspective, but not stepping so far out of it that one is completely away from the evidence and completely away from the things that are understood and the things that are currently known to be true. And so, so have these very sort of extreme characters that are kind of completely anti anything mainstream. And I think that often is, for me personally, I find it unhelpful because, any of us get run over by a bus. We all want the painkillers. We all want the things to manage infection. We want the surgery. We want all the wonders of mainstream medicine. And the thing that I'm often saying to patients or prospective patients of our clinic is that people don't come to people like us if they just want the sort of standard mainstream approach. We don't exist if that has all of the answers. And so it's that real balance of innovation with also the kind of respect of true sort of scientific value and principle.
So just two quick questions for you. If someone wants to find you in the real world or the virtual world, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the best place to go, so my clinic is the optimumhealthclinic.com, so they can find out about our clinical services there. And then you can find me at alexhoward.com, and you'll find my various courses, programs, professional trainings, and everything there.
Awesome. And then final question, is there any other question I should have asked you but forgot to?
I think you asked some great questions. I think the thing that I would always say in ending is that, people can transform their health. And, the key is decoding what's happening and finding the right intervention. And it's different for different people. And it's why podcasts like this are great, because people can learn lots of different approaches and methodologies, but it's always possible to move things forward.
Awesome. Alex, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And I really appreciate your being here today.
Great. Josh, thanks for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
Cheers. All right. We should do this again. All right. Bye-bye.